Friends, we are with you on the Volkhov River. This is the Leningrad region of the Russian Federation. And here, in addition to the legendary river along which there was a route from the Varangians to the Greeks, when the Swedes sailed boats across the rivers in Rus to the Black Sea and to Greece, there are also ancient graves and monuments. The burial hills where, according to the legends of the Novgorod Chronicle, the prophetic Oleg, Rurik's comrade in arms, who was called to rule from Sweden to Slavic Rus in the 9th century, was buried. But that's not the point. Today we will have a historical issue about ancient Russia, ancient Northern Rus. I will show you the city of Volkhov. I will show you the village of Old Ladoga, which is the original capital of ancient Rus. Watch the episode until the end. Understand the history of Russia. Maybe you will partly like this episode, partly not, but I am filming as best I can and I need your support, comments and likes. Do not judge strictly. This issue will be with historical overtones and with a love for history that surrounds us everywhere. Have a nice walk with me. Today is an unusual walk and excursion. It is dedicated to everyone who is interested in the history of the Russian state. First, we need to get off the St. Petersburg-Volkhov train and we go straight to the Volkhovstroy 1 station. The station was opened in 1904 on the newly built line St. Petersburg-Vologda. The original name was Zavonka. In 1934 it was renamed Volkhovstroy. An important feature that you see on the screen is that at the station there is a steam locomotive monument EU 708-64. This is the first steam locomotive to arrive in Leningrad after the blockade was broken. This was on February 7, 1943, and then he brought a train with food and ammunition to the Finley and Sky station in St. Petersburg. But you are already inside the station. In 1942, the old wooden station building was destroyed by an air raid, but it was partially restored. In 1949, a new station building was built here, which became one of the most beautiful buildings in the Leningrad region. In 1944, construction began on a new station building, which was completed in 1951. The modern station building provided a variety of facilities for various needs, including a first aid station, restrooms, a hairdresser's salon, a duty station and a restaurant. In the 1990s, the station began to fall into disrepair and had to be reconstructed. The station was a completely self-sufficient system, with a single clock and a tower clock, which were the only ones of its kind in the entire Leningrad region. Well, we immediately rushed to Old Ladoga, but we also returned to the city of Volkhov, and I'll show you some streets and interesting local places. After all, the main goal of the release is Old Ladoga, a village in the Volkhov municipal district of the Leningrad region. Old Ladoga is the ancient capital of northern Russia. It turns out that in a day you can explore the fortress, a 500-year-old street in Ladoga, and even on the Volkhov River try to look for another place of the supposed burial of prophetic Oleg, the ruler of the Novgorod land since 879 and the Prince of Kiev since 882. But there is another main burial place of prophetic Oleg, in Kiev, but some researchers dispute this point. In general, I will divide our excursion into 2 parts. The first will be dedicated to Old Ladoga and we will talk about Old Northern Rus. And then we will return to Volkhov and I will tell you some interesting facts about this area. After all, Volkhov is also a little interesting, at least for its engineering construction. We are talking about the Volkhov hydroelectric power station named after Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. This hydroelectric power station on the Volkhov River, the first large hydroelectric power station in Russia, a Russian cultural heritage site of federal significance. Built in 1927, construction began under Lenin in 1917.
Look!
Are these ferries that come here along the Volkhov from Lake Ladoga?
Yes, of course it is them. Now they only reach the old Ladoga fortress along the river, when before they walked along the Volkhov to Veliki Novgorod. As soon as a lock on the river is made in the city of Volkhov, these river tourist ferries will go further along the river.
Super.
And then you can get out and follow the road towards the fortress.
Okay, Igor, Thank you for the advice. All the best to you and good luck. Good travel companions to you.
And all the best to you, to your health.
First, along the way, we will quickly visit the Orthodox Street, Nicholas Monastery. The Old Ladoga Nikolsky Monastery is located near the walls of the ancient Nikolsky Church. It was built in the 12th or 13th centuries in its original construction. The area where the monastery is located is unusual, right on the left bank of the Volkhov River, under a hill. The exact date of creation of the monastery is unknown to us. The first documentary evidence of the Old Ladoga Street, Nicholas Monastery found in the Quitrent census books of Obunskaya and Vodskaya Pyatina, and they already date back to the end of the 15th century. The monastery cathedral church, built in the 13th century, was consecrated in the name of the most revered saint in Russia, Street, Nicholas the Wonderworker, the patron saint of sailors, fishermen and travelers. Today, one of the dominant features of the monastery is also the Church of St. John Chrysostom, built on the principle of an ancient basilica. It was built according to the design of academician of architecture Alexei Maximovich Gornostayev over 13 years in 1873 on the site of a dilapidated 17th century temple. On the vaults, walls and arches of the temple, paintings have been preserved to this day, scenes from the life of St. John Chrysostom, as well as gospel scenes in the style of academic realism with Byzantine-style ornaments. During the Soviet years of the USSR, the monastery, of course, ceased to exist. It was plundered and desecrated. Temples and other buildings are occupied by village residents. Only in the mid-20th century did people pay attention to the unique monument. The only unique temple that suffered the most in those years was Nikolsky. Workers preserving the cultural heritage of those years carry out various studies, manipulations and examinations on it, as a result of which a decision is made to dismantle the later built parts of the ancient church. In 2002, by decision of the Holy Synod of the Russian Orthodox Church, the monastery was opened for the revival of monastic life. In recent years, thanks to the efforts of parishioners and pilgrims, the monastery has continued its revival. From the Italian city of Bari, Metropolitan of St. Petersburg and Ladoga Vladimir brought to the monastery a particle of the relics of St. Nicholas, Archbishop of Myra. In the northeastern tower of the monastery there is a chapel in the name of the Savior not made by hands. In October 2010, the premises of the monastery library and Sunday school were opened to visitors. In general, life here is in full swing for believers. But we are primarily interested in the old Slavic fortress, where the invited Swedes lived, and we are heading there right now. Look at this beautiful fortress of Old Ladoga. Around 753, people from the Swedish island of Gotland founded Old Ladoga, located 2 kilometers upstream of the Volkhov from the Lubsha fortress, nowadays a stone earth fortress in northern Russia that has not survived. The foundation of the settlement in this territory was representatives of the original Slavic culture of Central European origin, which they, in turn, conquered in the early 700s from the local Finno-Balts. In the 760s, the Ladoga settlement was destroyed by representatives of the early Slavic culture from the northwest, the Dnieper left bank or the Dniester region, the Danube region, the upper reaches of the Dnieper, the western Dvina or the Volga, and was built up with houses of log construction. This settlement existed until the 830s and was again captured by the Scandinavian Varangians. Further, describing approximately this time period, the Tale of Bygone Years reports, they drove the Varangians overseas, and did not give them tribute, and began to control themselves, and there was no truth among them, and generation after generation arose, and they had strife, and began to fight with each other. And they said to themselves, let us look for a prince who would rule over us and judge us by right. And they went overseas to the Varangians, to Russia. Those Varangians were called Rus, just as others are called Swedes, and others are Normans and Angles, and still others are Gotlanders. They said, our land is great and abundant, but there is no order in it. Come reign and rule over us. And 3 brothers were chosen with their clans, and they took all of Russia with them. And they came, and the eldest, Rurik, sat down in Novgorod, and the other, Sinius, on Beluzero, and the third, Truvor, in Izborsk. And from those Varangians the Russian land was nicknamed. Novgorodians are those people from the Varangian family, and before they were Slovenians. According to the Ipatiev and Radziv Ilev chronicles, in 862, at the confluence of the Ladoga River and the Volkhov called to Rain, Rurik rebuilt a wooden fortress, where he settled with his retinue, before moving further south along the Volkhov and settling at the Rurik settlement near Veliki Novgorod. This date, with reservations about a certain convention of chronicle dating, is recognized according to archaeological data. Thus, the first wooden fortification on the site of the Old Ladoga fortress was erected, according to the assumption of the St. Petersburg Soviet and Russian archaeologist Anatoly Kirpichnikov, no earlier than the 60s of the 9th century. The fortification of that time protected only a small part of the settlement, since it was originally built only for the prince and his squad. At the turn of the 9th and 10th centuries, instead of wooden fortifications, a stone fortress was erected, similar to Western European defensive structures of that time. The walls of the fortress were built without the use of lime mortar. So, we are inside the Old Ladoga fortress. Before us is the white stone church of St. George. This is an inactive white stone Orthodox church from the second half of the 12th century, one of the oldest surviving churches in Russia. I am the northernmost Russian stone temple of the pre-Mongol period. Fragments of unique Orthodox Christian frescoes of the 12th century have been preserved in the temple. It has the status of an architectural monument of federal significance. The architecture of the temple is typical of the Novgorod school of architecture. According to most researchers, the Church of St. George was handed over to the customer in 1166 after the Russian army defeated the Swedes on the Voronezha River. The first Novgorod chronicle reports that in 1164 the Swedes attacked the Ladoga fortress. The people of Ladoga, shut up in the city, sent to Novgorod for the prince and the army. Soon, Prince Svetoslav and the Novgorodians came with the mayor Zachariah. The Swedes were defeated, but in order to maintain trade with them, the Swedish lands were not devastated in response, as shown in the fresco. Further, the fate of the Old Ladoga fortress underwent various events. In 1313, the Swedes took the fortress and burned it. At that time Old Ladoga was part of the Novgorod Republic. In 1338, the Swedes unsuccessfully stormed the fortress again. It was rebuilt in stone in the 16th century due to the spread of firearms. The Klementovskaya and Vorotnaya towers, as well as the spinning mill between them, have survived to this day. In essence, all these towers were restored in the 20th century on an ancient basis. The northwestern and eastern rivers have reached us in the form of ruins. In 1586, a tree-earth fortification was added to the southern side of the stone fortress. In 1610, the Swedes were still able to defeat the Novgorodians and took the fortress. In 1701, the Swedes besieged the fortress for the last time. After the end of the Northern War, it lost its military significance. This happened already under Peter the Great. In 1910, exploration work was carried out, and for 2 years until 1913, systematic excavations of the Zemlyannoy settlement were carried out. In 1931, systematic archaeological research began on the Old Ladoga fortress. In the 1970s, restoration work was carried out, and in 1971, the first museum exhibitions opened in the Old Ladoga fortress. The Old Ladoga Local History Museum was opened. In Soviet times, 2 of the 5 fortress towers were restored, Klementovskaya and Vorotnaya. In 2008, work began on the restoration of the switch tower in the center of the fortress wall connecting the switch and gate towers. Probably, the fortress would have been completely destroyed if not for its restoration, which took place in the 20th century. Meanwhile, we reached an ordinary village street. If you don't know that it is at least 600 years old. Here in 2015 a monument was erected to the collectors of Russian lands, Rurik and Oleg the Prophet. Historians argue a lot about who Rurik was and where he came from. It is important that Rurik is the first chronically reliable Russian prince. Rurik's successor Oleg more than 1,000 years ago accomplished the historical union of Novgorod Russia and Kievan Russia. Rurik and Oleg went down in history as collectors of Russian lands. They stopped internal strife and united the tribes from Novgorod to Polotsk and from Murom to Rostov. Rurik, along with other statesmen who played a key role in the history of the country, is immortalized on the Millennium of Russia monument in Veliki Novgorod. This is his only sculptural image. Until recently, there was no separate monument to the founder of Russian statehood. Well, we go further towards Oleg's grave. Or rather, the place of the supposed burial of prophetic Oleg. The first version tells us that he was buried in Kiev. Our route goes north, literally 1.5 kilometers. The circumstances of the death of prophetic Oleg are contradictory. The tale of bygone years reports that Oleg's death was preceded by a heavenly sign, the appearance of a great star in the west like a spear. According to the Kiev version, reflected in the tale of bygone years, his grave is located in Kiev on Mount Shekovitsa, above Kiev Podol. The Novgorod First Chronicle places his grave in Ladoga, but at the same time says that he went overseas. In both versions there is a legend about death from a snakebite. According to legend, the Magi predicted to the prince that he would die from his beloved horse. Oleg ordered the horse to be taken away and remembered the prediction only 4 years later, when the horse had long since died. Oleg laughed at the Magi and wanted to look at the bones of the horse, stood with his foot on the skull and said, "Should I be afraid of him?" However, a poisonous snake lived in the horse's skull, which fatally bit the prince. This legend finds parallels in the Icelandic saga of the Viking Orvar Odd, the saga of Odd the Arrow, who was also fatally stung at the grave of his beloved horse. It is not known whether the saga became the reason for the creation of the ancient Russian legend about Oleg or, on the contrary, the circumstances of Oleg's death served as material for the saga. However, the mounds here on the Volkhov River are graves. During explorations in 1820, covering about a third of the entire mound, several burnt bones and arrows dating from the 8th century to the early 9th century were discovered. No further archaeological excavations were carried out here. In the Novgorod Chronicle the following mention follows. And Oleg went to Novgorod, and from there to Ladoga. Friends say that he was walking across the sea, but a snake bit him on the leg, and from this he died. There has been his grave in Ladoga since then. In the tale of bygone years it sounds different, and people all cried with great tears. And they carried it and buried it on the mountain where Shekovitsa is located. His grave exists to this day. Well, that's probably all with Old Ladoga. Let us fast forward back to Volkhov. Before you is the Volkhov hydroelectric power station, the first large hydroelectric power station in Russia, an object of cultural heritage of Russia of federal significance. Preparatory work for the construction of the Volkhov hydroelectric power station began in 1917, but in the first year's construction was carried out at a low pace and was intensified after the station was included in the GOELRO plan. The first hydraulic unit of the Volkhov hydroelectric power station was launched in 1926, and the following year the station reached full capacity. During the Great Patriotic War, the station supplied electricity to besieged Leningrad via a cable laid along the bottom of Lake Ladoga. The Volkhov hydroelectric power station was located near the front line and was shelled several times. In 1941, a significant part of the station's equipment was evacuated. By 1945, the hydroelectric power station was restored. Hello, are you already closing? Is the museum closing already?
Yes. We already have the last tourists on excursions inside. We are closed.
But can I just go into the hall of the house and look inside? I am filming an episode about Russia for foreigners. I think it would be interesting.
Okay, come on in.
Here we go to the Museum of the History of the City of Volkhov. This is the former building of engineer Genrik Osipovich Graftio, the head of the construction of the Volkhov hydroelectric power station. The building was erected according to the design of an unknown master in 1924, when very active work was underway to put the station itself into operation. The Volkhov hydroelectric power station played an important role in the energy supply of Leningrad. In the first years after its commissioning, it provided more than 40% of the city's electricity needs. Another consumer of the station's electricity was the first aluminum smelter in the USSR. The reservoir of the hydroelectric power station flooded the rapids on the Volkhov, which were a significant obstacle to navigation, and the emergence of the city of Volkhov was also a consequence of its construction. My friends stayed at the Volkhov hydroelectric station and are waiting for me.
Then you can just go into the engineer's office and take a picture of him. He is too beautiful and old.
Okay, let us go to the office. This is the office of Graftio, the builder of the Volkhov hydroelectric power station.
Yes, this is his office.
How long did he live here? Interesting. Engineer Graftio seems to be a purebred German? Or not?
It is actually unclear. Our local historians have looked through the archives and found Dutch roots. His grandfather takes Russian citizenship. Accordingly, the father. And it turns out that engineer Graftio himself also has Russian citizenship. It simply says citizen of Russia. Although the surname is Italian, the name is German. Although Osipovich is like a Russian patronymic.
But all this could be Russified for ease of communication in Russia.
Yes, that is exactly what happened. In general, he often signed Joseph in books or deeds of gift. Come visit us during business hours and we will give you a tour.
Okay, thank you. I'll visit you in the future. In 1902, Genrik Osipovich Graftio developed his first project for the Volkhov hydroelectric station. This is a prominent builder of the first hydroelectric power stations in the USSR, Akademischen Academy of Sciences of the USSR. In fact, he was a Russified Dutchman in Russian service. Born into the family of a railway worker, a descendant of a noble family from the Netherlands. In 1910, the Ministry of Railways of the Russian Empire thought about electrifying the St. Petersburg Railway Junction, the source of electricity for which was supposed to be the Volkhov hydroelectric station. Under the leadership of engineer Palitsin, research was carried out and a project was drawn up for a run of the river hydroelectric power station with a capacity of 30 megawatts, with a dam 13 meters high, a 3-chamber sluice and the transmission of electricity to St. Petersburg via an alternating current power line with a voltage of 110 kilovolts. At the same time, Graftio proposed its project for the Volkhov hydroelectric station. Thus, in 1912, both engineers presented a joint project for a hydroelectric power station. You see different bridge supports, old supports from the Russian Empire and new supports from the times of the USSR. In the summer of 1917, preparatory work began on the construction of the Volkhov hydroelectric power station. However, due to the October Revolution, excavation work on the site did not have time to begin, and in February 1918, construction was mothballed. At the beginning of March 1918, Lenin gave instructions to meet with Graftio to clarify information about the state of construction and its cost. After the meeting, Graftio drew up a construction estimate. On March 18, 1918, Lenin, participating in a meeting of the Electrical Engineering Department and the Economic Policy Committee of the Supreme Economic Council, gave instructions to build the Volkhov. That is probably all you need to know about these places. It seems that the city is small, only 37,000 people, but there are more than 1 hour worth of stories from these places. In conclusion, I will summarize our conversation with a local taxi driver, who persistently spoke about the correctness of the burial of prophetic Oleg in Kyiv. We go to look at the grave of prophetic Oleg, the prince of the Russian lands. Do you think that there really is the grave of prophetic Oleg there? Or was Oleg buried in Kyiv? And this is all a legend and fairy tales from the Novgorod Chronicles?
I argued with one museum employee when I gave her a ride in a taxi. But we all remained unconvinced. She didn't convince me, just as I didn't convince her. But she tried to convince me that Oleg was really on a hike here.
Yes, the prophetic Oleg definitely went on a hike in this place. But the question is precisely the burial. We actually share your opinion regarding his burial. And we also think that his burial is in Kyiv.
In Old Ladoga you only need to communicate with a guide or the director of the museum. Because the ordinary grandmothers who work there don't know much at all. We just talked with the director of the museum. This is a young girl, quite erudite. But our journey was short, and we communicated for no more than 15 minutes. And of course we didn't have time to voice all the arguments. Therefore, they could not reach the truth.
Listen, how navigable is the Volkhov River now? After all, Swedes used to sail along it to Greece. Is the draft of ships deep in the water? How deep is the river, since there is a fairway? Does the same lock at the Volkhov hydroelectric station allow large ships to pass through the river?
The gateway is currently undergoing restoration. It is being repaired. And where should ships go now? They go from Lake Ladoga to the fortress and back. Previously, of course, we went to Veliki Novgorod and Lake Ilmen. And now the gateway is not working. That's why ships don't sail.
Why did this happen? Is there little money or the tourist route is irrelevant?
Probably irrelevant. But due to the closure of borders, the tourist flow in Russia will increase. The lock will be repaired and ships will be launched. Because all this became relevant a little after 2003. It began to flourish immediately after the 1990s. The restoration of the fortress began, and an invasion of pilgrims and travelers occurred. This did not happen before in the 1990s. As soon as Old Ladoga was recognized as the capital of Northern Rus, the people moved. In Soviet times, everything was in Christmas trees. We also went on excursions here. But the restoration was not completed. But in the 1990s everything was bad. Nobody went.
Listen, it was just chance that ordered it to revive river traffic. Through Old Ladoga to Volkhov, from there to Veliki Novgorod and further to the Rurik settlement and Lake Ilmen. This is the ancient route of the Varangians.
I think that now the restoration of the gateway began precisely because of this. I think they will be able to launch this route in the near future. I am local, I see 2 ships docking there every day. This means they come along the river, people have an interest in these places. There are river ferries on 3 decks.
Friends, this episode comes to an end. I ask you to like this video, write your comment and share this video with your friends. Explore Russia with me. But let me remind you that there are many episodes on my channel from other countries. There are Turkey, Georgia, Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Belarus, Russia. New releases will be prepared in the future. So subscribe to the channel and don't miss new episodes. And with this we will say goodbye. See you in new releases.